Okay, hi everybody. So this will be our last class for the summer. We'll probably resume either end of August, beginning of September. Okay, so I just want to wish you all a good summer, and we'll take a nice break. We'll come back refreshed in time for getting ready for the high holidays. Okay. So we are discussing the Kuzari, and we were looking at the significance of the Hebrew language. That's what we were talking about, using Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's discussion of Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. So we talked a little bit about the uniqueness of the Hebrew language, the fact that it was the language that God used as the ingredients for all of physical reality. In other words, according to Sefer Yetzirah, it's not just that God used words to create the world, but actually the letters of those words are the DNA, or what you could say, the molecules in the atoms of all of reality. So if we break down all of the particles into their most basic element, you get letters. And it's a fascinating concept. Let me just share my screen here. It's a fascinating concept because, good morning, because it also suggests that every human being, through the letters that they create, has the ability, or through the letters that they assemble, I should say, has the ability to be a creator. When any person who writes, when you're an author or you tell a story, you're a creator in a sense. The only difference between an author and God is that we create a world that is non-physical. We create a conceptual world. God creates the physical reality with the letter, but we're using the same letters of communication that you and I use. So obviously that indicates that there's something very, very deep and profound about the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And that gives rise to a whole mystical tradition of the uniqueness of the Hebrew language. And so last time we touched upon this idea about why it's important to pray in Hebrew, according to this school of thought, even if you feel that your words would be more heartfelt if you prayed in the language that's your mother language. But there's something special and unique about the Hebrew language. So obviously, for those of us who grew up with a foreign language as our primary language, our mama lashon is English, and not, for most of us, I don't know, for some of you it may be Yiddish or Hungarian or whatever, but for me it's English, right? So there's a certain depth of thought and emotion that I am able to better express myself in English. But when it comes to the words of prayer, there's something mystical that is supernatural, transcendent about the Hebrew language. And so therefore, what would be optimal for any individual is to find the ability through study and through the study of language to learn how to express themselves most profoundly in Hebrew. Okay, and so this gives rise to what we're up to on page 455, paragraph number 10. Based on this, it should not seem strange that holy names and the like, written and spoken in Hebrew, can have an effect on creation, provided that their utterance or writing is preceded by the proper mental measurements. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying that incantations are a thing. That if a person is a mystic and they know how to pronounce certain things on an incantational level, and that's, you know, the whole secret behind amulets, which we talked about also, and how Maimonides did not believe in this stuff, right? But it's really a thing for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And it has to be accompanied by proper mental measurements, meaning by this we mean that the words must be accompanied by the thoughts of a pure soul that resembles angels. Not everyone who wants to be able to use these incantations will be successful. You have to have the proper mental and preparation, and also there must be an aspect of piety as well. I'm just going to mute everybody.
That's interesting, Rabbi, if I may.
Yes, please.
Because you would think that if you're saying the letters themselves are imbued with such holiness that, and so when we pray in Hebrew, but whether or not we have the kavana is a whole other thing, and the holiness of thought. But we can't always control our thoughts, but we can pray in Hebrew. So it's creating a whole other level of what we need to really have for those letters to actually have that spark.
Yeah, in this school of thought, the letters themselves have their own independent power, independent of what I'm thinking. But he does say that in order to be able to have more of an impact, even on a metaphysical level, there has to be proper thought put into those letters. And there also has to be a pure soul that resembles angels. So in other words, the words that are coming out of my mouth are connected in some way to my neshama. And that neshama has to be a pure neshama in order for those words to have their desired effect. And so then coming back to this Sefer Yetzirah, this opening sentence that he had started us off with, if you recall, the Sefer Yetzirah had opened up with this idea that the three letters Samech Pei Reish are in some way connected to the very roots of creation. In this way, the three Samech Pei Reishes, Safar, Sipur, and Sefer, which is that God counted, God related, and God inscribed, are brought together as one. Thus, the imagined effect, which this pure soul mentally measured, and of which he spoke and wrote, will come into being. And that's really why the Sefer Yetzirah is known as a recipe book for how to create. If you want to become a creator, if you want to be able to create your own reality, so follow the Sefer Yetzirah, because it gives you a recipe for how God created our world. And if you have the depth of soul, you can do the same thing. Now, with this in mind, I would just want to share with you that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is not alone in this contention. As you know, as we've spoken about a lot, the Rambam felt that this was all nonsense, really quite literally nonsense. He just didn't subscribe to it because as an Aristotelian philosopher, he felt that the science of his day really was the best explanation of all of physical reality, and that there just wasn't power within the human soul to manipulate the forces of nature in the way that the mystics of his time were describing. And so therefore, he doesn't have very much regard for this whole school. But there's the Kabbalistic school. Rav Moshe Chaim Lutzato in his Derech Hashem has a whole section on what he calls theurgy, or the ability to manipulate the forces of nature through incantations and other methods. We recommend, if you're going to learn Derech Hashem, or the way of God, you get the Aryeh Kaplan translation, which is it's a classic. It was done back in the 70s, I think, and it's really just very well done. So along the course of this discussion of theurgy, of kishuf, of being able to tap into the forces of nature and manipulate the forces of nature in a supernatural way, Rav Luzzatto writes as follows: God also desired to be called by a name. Through this name, his handiwork could be aware of him and call him, and also bring themselves close to him by uttering it. So we don't know what this name is. It could be the four-letter name of God. It could be other names of God. For his glory, God specified the unique name, the Shem HaMeforash, the name that is the four-letter tetragrammaton, the four-letter Yud Kei Vav Kei, regarding which he said, "This is my name forever." This is God's name with respect to the glory itself, to the extent that he desires to have a name. God makes use of other influences, however, and with respect to each of them, he also has various names. God also decreed and ordained that when man would utter his name, divine illumination and influence would be bestowed upon him. This is what God means when he says, in every place where I allow my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. When a particular name of God is uttered and used to call upon him, it will result in the emanation of an influence associated with that name. The type of influence transmitted will be that related to that particular name by God by virtue of its mystery. Of course, this is all very cryptic. When a particular influence is transmitted, it will necessarily give rise to the results ordained for it. Its particular effects will then spread through the entire sequence from the beginning to the end, as discussed earlier. This entire process, however, is circumscribed by the highest wisdom. God thus decreed that a name should only transmit an influence and have an effect when uttered under specific conditions within defined limits. Very reminiscent of what we just learned in this paragraph in the Kuzari that he said, right? In other words, it can have an effect provided that their utterance or writing is preceded by the proper mental measurements. And as Luzzatto writes, otherwise it has no effect at all. God arranged that some of the influences motivated by the utterance of his names should have the power of suspending the limitations of nature with regard to the one making use of them. This particular individual can thereby connect himself to spiritual phenomena and bring him knowledge and understanding which are superior to that obtainable via human intelligence alone. So one of the benefits is not just to manipulate the forces of nature, but also to obtain hidden knowledge. So there's a tradition that we have, the mystical tradition, that says that a Makubal, a Kabbalist, has the ability to obtain information that nobody else has. And that's why you'll find sometimes that people will go to a Makubal to be able to find out. They may give the Makubal their Hebrew name, other information, and the Makubal will somehow be able to provide some insight that another person may not be able to have. I remain agnostic about these things. There's a part of me that will very much wants to believe in these things, and I've gone to Mekubalim myself in the past, when we were, in challenging situations. But there's a part of me that has a healthy level of skepticism also, especially because there's an expectation of compensation, remuneration at the end of the session. So look, everyone's got to eat, right? So I don't begrudge anyone for getting paid for their services, but there's a certain, I don't know, I'm not sure what to make of it. And it's very hard for me to know what's authentic and what's not. Listen, I also believe that there are certain people, whether religious or holy or not, that have a certain ability to intuit things that other people cannot intuit. And I think you've all met those kinds of people. They're empathic. They pick up on vibes. I don't know what, there's probably a better word for that. That they can pick up on emotions, they can pick up on things that are going on. And it's not, I'm not cynical enough to think that all these people are just fakes and exploiters. I think there are genuinely people who have a certain kind of a sensitivity to things that other people are not sensitive to. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that sort of transcends the norms of sensitivity and empathy, and really speaks to being able to tap into knowledge that is only knowable through a prophetic experience, because a person has used the names of Hashem to tap into certain areas of knowledge that are not accessible to regular human beings. So included in this are the various levels of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, and Nevuah, prophecy, which we shall discuss at length in the next chapter. So he basically says, Rav Luzzatto, that sometimes you can use incantations using certain names and words to be able to tap into those forces of Ruach HaKodesh, of divine inspiration, and obtain special knowledge. Yes?
since you mentioned that you went to Nicobarn, what was the outcome? Did you feel that they said he or she said anything?
It was he. It was always he. I don't think I've ever been to a female makubal. Not that they don't. I don't know if any of them exist.
Yeah, I was just joking.
Okay, all right.
I've never been to one myself, so I'm just wondering, at the end of the day, did he say anything that made you think, oh, this guy does know something?
Yes. But I'm going to give you a qualified yes. So Rachel's question is, did I ever leave like really impressed with the makubal? And the answer is yes. But it's a qualified yes. And that's the reason for skepticism. The qualified yes is how much of it was wishful thinking on my part and on my wife's part. You know, when you have a sick child and you go to a makubal, or you have someone who's going through one of your children going through a challenge in life, right? And the makubal tells you, I see his neshama, and he's got a very deep neshama, and there's something very special here, and you're going. So how much of that is like, you're telling me what I want to know, and therefore it's true, and how much of it is that he really sees it? And I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you with absolute certainty that it's either real or it's not real. I just don't know, though. Okay.
To illuminate such a positive way, like does ignite, like it does. We believe in, that energy, and we do scientific studies that actually show that the bodies of, you speak kindly to the plant, you speak words of kedusha versus words of anger, and how that the physical world has a physical reaction. So I just like emanating words of Amuna is going to open up wellspring of bracha.
Right. When you think positive, when you speak positive, then positivity emerges from the world. That's something we believe. Yeah. But you talked about plants, playing music to plants and playing music to children. So also it has a positive impact. It has to be the right kind of music, obviously, right? They say that if you play classical music when children are infants, it raises their IQ level also. But again, I don't know if I'm not sure that this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that transcends nature, Okay. Anyway, just to finish this off, God decreed that inspiration and prophecy could be attained also in this manner, namely through the names associated with God with respect to these influences. This occurs when one repeats one of these names mentally, utters it verbally, or combines it with other words, and at the same time fulfills all the other required conditions, which shall be discussed later. Now, the book Derech Hashem is not going to be sort of a how-to manual, and nor is Sefer Yetzirah. These books are very cryptic, and a person really, in order to become an expert in these matters, would have to sort of go under mentorship of a master Mekubal, and those people do exist, but it's not something that I've ever sought out for myself, and I don't know anyone else who does it, but I'm sure they're around. So just wanted to let you know that this is definitely the mindset of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, which is also probably one of the reasons that the Rambam doesn't really cite Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in any of his writings, because it's a very, very different worldview from the Maimonidean rationalistic worldview. Okay. All right, so we'll hold it here, and let's go on to our Parsha discussion. And just for those who came on a little bit later, this will be our last shir for the
Summer.
for this
For
semester,
summer.
whatever you want to call it. And we will, Be'ezrat Hashem, resume sometime either at the end of August or the beginning of September. Okay, so let's go to Parsha Shelach. The title of today's Devar Torah is The Burden of Wealth. And I just want to make a couple of observations, look at a classic medieval commentary, and then just launch it from there. When the spies came back, they were very clear that their impression of the land was not in any way different from what they had been promised. Because they themselves said, Vigam zabat chalavu devash hi. They said it is a land that flows with milk and honey. They didn't contradict Moshe Rabbeinu in any way regarding the quality of the land, its agricultural productivity and blessing. And they said, Vizeh pirya, they even brought back its produce. And as we know from the Midrash and from the Talmud, the size of the sheer size of the produce was enormous. And it just demonstrated that the land was extremely fertile. What was their first criticism? Their first criticism was not of the land, it was of the people of the land. Efes ki az ha'am hayoshev ba'aretz. It is the people of that land are fierce. Okay? The cities are well fortified. The people are warriors. Amalek lives there among the other Canaanite tribes, and they're very, very formidable. And it takes someone like Kalev to reassure the people that despite the formidability of the population, we will be able to defeat them. But the spies said that it's Haaretz asher avarnu vala turota, the land that we have passed through, Eretz ochelet yoshvehahi. They then said that it is a land that consumes its inhabitants. Now that seems strange, because if they already got through saying that it is a fertile, productive, blessed land, how could they then say that it is a land that eats its inhabitants? Now that's the way we normally translate this verse. Eretz ochelet yoshvehahi. Is there any other way to translate those words, those four words? It is Eretz ochelet yoshvehahi, a land that eats its inhabitants or consumes its inhabitants. So all of the Meforshim understand it in its literal sense, but there's an obscure commentary called Sefer Mishnah Kesef. It was written in the early 14th century by a Rabbi Yosef ibn Kaspi that modern scholars have become very interested in, 20th and 21st century scholars. And I was speaking with someone and he mentioned to me his interest in Ibn Kaspi. So I just actually happened to be looking at the Sefer when I found this amazing commentary from Ibn Kaspi. He says, Eretz ochelet yoshveha, hinei heim amru tova haaretz ma'od. He says, I don't get it. He says, the spies acknowledged that it was a very good land. Im kain eich yikachashu heim ba'atzmam. How could they now contradict themselves? Lomar shihi michala yoshveha, to say now that it destroys its inhabitants. Kemosha katvu hameforshim, as the commentaries seem to say that that's what they're now saying. So which one is it? Is it a land flowing with milk and honey, or is it a land that consumes its inhabitants? So Ibn Kaspi's conclusion is, Aval perusho kemo ke'ela novelet aleha. He quotes a pasuk from the first chapter of Isaiah. And I just have it here just on the sheet, just so that you can see it. Ki tihiyu, the prophet is criticizing the nation of Israel. Because you followed foreign gods, you are like an elah, which is a very, let's say, a tree that doesn't produce fruit, novelet aleha, whose leaves are rotting with rotting leaves. The Navi basically calls them, you're a tree that is fruitless and has rotting leaves. And the Chagana Shemaim Einla, and you're like a garden without water, right? You're just shriveling and dying. That's what he's basically saying. But from a grammatical standpoint, Ibn Kaspi says, just like over there, when you say that you are like a tree, novelet aleha, that is rotting its leaves, that's a strange way to say it. Shepirusho she'aleha novlin. The real way to read it is, you are like a tree whose leaves are rotting. So you have to put in the word whose. It's not that the tree is rotting its leaves, but it's a tree whose leaves are rotting. And the same sentence structure is in this verse as well. V'chein zeh, when they said Eretz ochelet yoshvehahi, they didn't mean that it's a land which is consuming its inhabitants. They said it's a land whose inhabitants are consuming. Okay? And what that means is, V'chein zeh sheyoshveha ochlin. It is a land that is filled with consumers. V'hineze ketam anshe midot. And that's why the last part of that verse is, V'chol ha'am asher ra'inu b'tocha, the entire nation that we saw in that land are people of midot. Now, what does midot mean over here? It means, we usually translate midot as character traits or measurements.
Right.
So what does the word midot over here mean? Ki kol ish hu ish midama. Every person is a person of substantial measurement. That's what they meant to say. V'chein kol ish ochel, because everyone has a very healthy appetite. Is essentially like everyone that we encountered is like consuming mass quantities of whatever they're consuming, whether it's clothing, food, goods, they're consumers, okay? They are of substantial measure. They're wealthy people. Uchlal hadavar. And so what they were trying to communicate, kihem hapchu shidchei haaretz shemitzad atzma tova. They said, look, the land is amazing. It's a wonderful place to live. It's got every amenity and every type of produce that you could hope for. Aval ki anasheha achlanim gidolim. Look what he writes. But the people that live there are big eaters. They're big consumers. Uba'alei orech gadol more al gevuratam. And the fact that they are of such great measure because of their ability to consume mass quantities is indicative of their strength, of their might. The fact is that when you live in a land that is so plentiful, the people become strong and hardy. That's the good word, right? They become hale and hardy, okay, because of the great productivity of the land. So in a sense, the way Ibn Kaspi is explaining what's going on over here is that the blessing itself is the curse. Of course, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but look what it does to its inhabitants. It's turning all of its inhabitants into hale and hardy people that are going to be too difficult for us to overcome. We are living off of the manna, and when we come into the land, we're going to be the 98-pound weaklings, okay? And how are we ever going to be able to overpower armies that have been spending years consuming very, very healthy and fattening and enriching foods and living off the fat of the land? It's just not going to, there are certain people who, because of the richness of the land, themselves become very, very rich and strong. Okay, that was the argument. Now, I'd like to extend it, possibly, that it's not just a fear that they're stronger than us because of the consumption that the land provides them with, but it's the consumerism that the land provides them with that they may have been concerned about. You see, I'd like to take Ibn Kasbi's explanation and really expand on it a little bit. It's very possible that the great concern that they had in coming to this brave new world is very similar to the types of concerns that people have had over the course of time, and that we're even seeing today with new technologies, that the concerns that people have. Like you may be familiar with the science fiction trope that the more technologically advanced we get, the more sedentary we become because we don't have to work the field anymore. The great concern with the Industrial Revolution was that with the ability to harvest land while sitting on your tractor, you no longer have the hale and hearty farmer. He's now the sedentary farmer who has the machinery do all the work for him. And this may have been part of the concern that Bnei Yisrael were expressing, is that today we appreciate what it means to work hard and at the end of the day, enjoy the fruit of our efforts, of our labor. But what's going to happen when we come into Eretz Yisrael? We may encounter a lifestyle that may actually turn us all into couch potatoes. And that's not good either. And so that may have been part of the concern when they called it Eretz Ochelet Yoshveha. The reason why it's phrased this way is that when you become a consumer, you become overcome by consumerism, you become consumed by your consumerism. And that, I think, is perhaps one of the fears that the Bnei Yisrael were expressing, if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And if that's the case, then it's possible that this is embedded within the text itself. Because what do we see that they complained about afterwards? The Bnei Yisrael cry on this night. We know that this is the night of Tisha B'Av, that when the Torah records Vatisa kol ha'edah, that everyone lifted up their voices and began to wail when they heard the report of the spies. And they said, Lumatnu be'eretz Mitzrayim, it would have been better for us to die in Egypt, or at least in this desert, than to come into this land. And so what do they say? V'lama Hashem mevi otanu el haaretz hazot. Why is God bringing us into this land, linpol b'cherev, to fall by the sword? Nashenu v'tapenu yihiyu lavaz. Our wives and our children will be despoiled. What if we were to translate it somewhat differently from the normative translation, that we'll die and our women and children will be taken captive? What if their concern was not so much that they'll die by the sword, but they'll die because they'll give in to the temptation of consumerism? And who's going to be the greatest casualty of consumerism? Our wives and our children, because invariably, those elements of society will become more pampered and become more spoiled, and you'll see a tremendous amount of dysfunction within relationships and families. Children will become spoiled, and you'll see what we're seeing today is that our wives and our children will, they won't know how to function properly. And so this, I believe, may be part of it could be one way of reading the psukim, whether that's in reality what the psukim are trying to convey, but certainly this is an alternate reading of the realities that we may be seeing today. Now, with this, yes, go ahead.
So I guess I thought I know things differently. I thought in the desert everything was taken care of for them, so they didn't have to do anything. And they were afraid when they came to Eretz Yisrael that now they have to work for everything. They have to work to get their food, to do everything. So it's a little bit.
It's a little bit different. Yes. We're presenting it just the opposite.
Yeah.
In the desert, it's true, their needs were taken care of, but they lived as minimalists. They did not have there were no luxury items in the desert. You had your basic food and clothing, but that's all you had in the desert. And when they get this report back of this luxurious style of living, and the people are hale and hearty because of it, maybe that fear, at least one way of reading it, is that that fear is what is that going to turn us into? What are we going to become as a result of that? Let's see. Karen, I would suggest that after 200 years of slavery, they would look forward to a few years of couch potato life. Yeah, perhaps. And maybe that was really, they saw that this was a great temptation. So I think that if you look at the ensuing paragraphs that come after the story of the spies, what you find is the Torah giving us mitzvot that are very much dependent upon our agricultural society. We find the laws of tithing and the necessity to give a portion of one's harvest to the Kohen and the Levi. We also read about the law of a person who sins b'shogeg, an unintentional sinner. Why is that mentioned after the story of the spies? Well, it seems to me that what God is reassuring Bnei Yisrael is that your whole fear is that your agricultural wealth is going to corrupt you and is going to completely distort the correct values that you've been working so hard to obtain. Realize that even with all of that wealth, you will be able to curb your appetites and to keep yourselves in check. Number one, through tithing and making sure that you share of your wealth with those who are less fortunate. And number two, that there's always going to be remedies of tshuva, of repentance through bringing of korbanot when you feel that you've made a mistake. And that really manifests itself. The ultimate manifestation of that, in my opinion, is the story that happens at the end of the Parsha. Vayu b'nei Yisrael bamidbar, that the Jewish people are in the desert. Vayimtzeu ish mekoshesh etzim b'yom haShabbat, and they find a man gathering sticks, gathering wooden sticks or wooden branches on Shabbos, and they put him to death. They execute him. Now, the question is, why did he do it? So there are opinions from the Midrash that say that this was a righteous man. His name was Tzalafchad. Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. Well, we know Tzalafchad more through his righteous daughters than we know the man himself. So the Midrash says that this was Tzalafchad. He was a righteous man, and he did this l'shem shamayim. So I'll just read for you what the Tosfos says in Bava Batra, quoting the Midrash. U'ma'aseh hamekoshesh haya b'tchilat arba'im miyad achar ma'aseh meraglim. That the Mekoshesh Eitzim committed this act of gathering sticks on Shabbos right after the story of the spies. The Amar b'Midrash, as the Midrash writes, the l'shem shamayim nitkavein, that his whole reason for doing this was for the sake of heaven. Shehayu omrim Yisrael, keven shenigzar alehem shelo likanes la'aretz mima'aseh meraglim, that the Jewish people were lamenting the fact, and they said, we've been consigned to a terrible fate. We have to wander through the desert for 40 years, and we're not going to go into the promised land. That's what basically Hashem punished them with. You criticized the land, you felt that you can't handle it. Well, guess what? You're going to get what you wanted. You're never going to get into the promised land. But they also, that leads to a certain sense of despair and of giving up. So shuv ein mechuyavim b'mitzvot. So they therefore thought, well, perhaps we don't have to do mitzvot anymore. You know, there's this whole theory that the Ramban mentions in his Torah commentary, that the reason for doing mitzvot in Chutz La'aretz is to help us practice to be ready to do the mitzvahs when we get into the real place of Eretz Yisrael. But the Jewish people thought, maybe we don't have to do, maybe we're absolved from mitzvos, because the whole reason for doing mitzvos in the midbar is to prepare ourselves for the real arena of doing mitzvot, which is in Eretz Yisrael, and we're not going to get in. So Amad v'chilel Shabbat, kidei sheyehareg v'yiru acherim. So he went ahead and deliberately went and violated Shabbos, knowing that he would be punished for it. so that people would learn and that people would realize, no, even though we're not getting into the land, but every person has purpose in the moment. And therefore, if you are still alive, you serve a purpose and you still have to do the mitzvot. And he wanted to demonstrate that by seeing that there are consequences to your behavior, even though you've been consigned never to go into the promised land. Now, I want to throw out a possible idea here that is consistent with what I'm suggesting is the deeper reading of this whole story. If we wanted to contemporize this story and apply it to what we're seeing in our lives today, that the real danger of our lives today is the consumerism that is available to all of us, and the fact that if we rest on our laurels and we live in the lap of luxury, we could fall into the trap of a poor value system, of a poor moral system that comes along with this abundance of wealth. So perhaps the Mekoshesh Eitzim had also something along those lines in mind as well. And perhaps he wanted to teach the people a lesson. You see, there's only one other place in the entire Torah where this verb lekoshesh appears. Where is it? Lekoshesh. What does it mean, lekoshesh, by the way? The Gemara debates what it means, lekoshesh. Does lekoshesh mean to gather, which is the simple understanding, or does it mean to harvest by pulling out from the ground? So there's a whole debate in the Talmud as to what the Mekoshesh Eitzim was guilty of. We don't have to go into that right now because that's not really relevant for our discussion. Was he guilty of carrying on Shabbos? Was he guilty of what's called me'amer, to make piles, which is one of the malachos of Shabbos? You're not allowed to make piles of things. Or was he guilty of pulling things out of the ground that are growing from the ground? It's a three-way machloket. But there's only one other place where you find that verb. It's in Exodus chapter 5. Vayafetz ha'am b'chol eretz Mitzrayim lekoshesh kash lateven. That verb is where the Jewish people had to go and gather straw to be able to make the bricks when they were in Egypt. So what is the significance of that? They were working very, very hard under slave labor conditions. It was backbreaking, it was oppressive. And I'm just wondering that perhaps what this Mekoshesh Eitzim, if he truly was L'Shem Shamayim, maybe he wanted to let the people know that you shouldn't romanticize hard work either. You know, your concerns about the failures of a consumerist society should not, there are people who romanticize hard work also inappropriately. Whether it's the communist ideal or whether it's the Calvinist ideal of getting calluses on your hands as the way of developing character, that can be taken too far as well. A person who believes that, there's nothing as good as a hard day's work should also remember that we, like Karen mentioned, after 200 years of slavery, you'd imagine that they would want to be couch potatoes. Maybe the Mekoshesh Eitzim, through his action, was reminding the people of what that event was like, to be Mekoshesh, the straw in Egypt. Yes, it's true. There were well-founded concerns about going into a land that was so rich and so abundant and so filled with amenities that it could end up destroying us and our value systems because of its advanced amenities. But at the same time, the other extreme is also not good. Remember where you came from, where you had to be Mekoshesh in order to survive. And that also spelled a death sentence for you. And that's why Hashem took us out from those conditions. And so I think that perhaps one of the lessons of this story is the burden of wealth that the Jewish people were concerned about, but also creating that balance that it's important to recognize that whatever state we are in, we romanticize the good old days or the days when things were very different. And perhaps the lesson of the Mikoshesh is, no, there was something very bad about those days in Egypt also. Even though there was something truly, that, you could idealize in your own mind about the good old days, but they weren't the way that you remember them either. There were a lot of problems in Egyptian society, not least of them the fact that we were slaves and that we were very, very harshly abused by the Egyptian taskmasters. So that's the idea behind this thought, is that it's all about creating balance. There is a lot of challenge in the world today. I mean, we look at, first of all, I think one of the things, we can't leave our discussion of this weekly shir without remembering what the situation is in Eretz Yisrael today. But there is this conversation that's being had as to, what were the underlying reasons for why the attack took place. And some people note that Hamas took advantage of the fact that there was this tremendous amount of civil unrest and a lack of confidence in Israel, in its government and in the government's abilities to do the things that it wanted it to do. And, part of the challenge in a modern 21st century Zionist society is reminding people of the ideals and the reasons why we want to be on this land. It can't just be because this is where I was born. There has to be something more to it. And sometimes when we become so absorbed in our consumerism, we lose sight of the bigger ideologies of what it means to be a Jew. And that could be in some way a sign of weakness of our people if we don't have that reinforcement. And so that's something that we need to think about. We need to think about the moral failings of our modern civilization, and to what degree we have succumbed to those moral failings in our own lives, whether it's the way we raise our children, which is a huge issue today, whether it is the way that we indulge in therapy because we've become so soft in the way that we deal with issues in our lives. And there's a lack of perhaps toughness, or maybe, I don't know what the word is. There's this new book by Abigail Schreier. You may know that name. She talks, the name of her book is called Bad Therapy, which sort of, or grit, yes, thank you, a lack of grit within our society. Her new book, Bad Therapy, is all about how we've created a society of snowflakes, I guess, that's the terminology that people have used, people who are overly sensitive and overly vulnerable and overly fragile. And that is part of that's part of an outgrowth of the wealth of our society. And again, it's not that we should pine for the good old days, because in the good old days, there was racism and discrimination and a lot of bloodshed, and people did not have it as good as we idealize it, working on the farm or doing hard labor, and there was no protection of migrant workers and things like that. So there were a lot of problems within society. But so we shouldn't over idealize the grit of the previous generation, but we also have to make sure that we try to compensate for the whatchamacallit, for this Eretz Ochelet Yoshveha, that it is a land where the people are big consumers. And we don't want to be identified as the generation of consumers, which is essentially what the way we're reading this pasuk is, the way Ibn Kaspi reads the pasuk is what the spies basically said. The people that we encountered are big consumers. That's what they are. And that's why it's going to be difficult for us, not only because they're strong, but also maybe because we don't want to become that. The very thing that we're going to be conquering is we're worried that the blessing may turn into a curse. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you for today. Any comments, questions? Yes, go ahead, Rafa.
Then negotiations and did Hashem kill him or did,
Bnei Israel put him to death. They executed him.
so didn't they need Asra and Adim?
Yes, that's a very good question. Didn't he need to be warned in advance? If the story itself indicates that they didn't know what to do with him. So, and Moshe had to ask Hashem, what are we supposed to do with him? So Hashem said, you have to put him to death by stoning. There's another story in the Torah that is also like that. The person in Parshas Emor who curses God, who is the Ben Isha Yisraelit, right? The man whose mother was Shlomit Bat Divri, and he cursed God because he didn't know where he could camp, and he also was put to death. And in both of those cases, there was a certain level of uncertainty as to what the punishment should be for those people. But the Talmud and other Meforshim explain that he did have Hasra. They told him, you're not allowed to gather sticks on Shabbos. And he said, I don't care. And they said, well, we don't know exactly what the punishment is, but it could be the death penalty. Are you still prepared to do that? That's the way you'd have to explain it in order to reconcile the fact that in order to be deserving of the death penalty, you need to have been forewarned. Okay. Let me just see anything else. Okay. If
Can I
not,
ask a question?
yes, go ahead, Karen.
So specifically about the second one about the Mikoshe Shitzim, why
Yeah.
wouldn't he have just said to the people, the laws still apply? I don't think, like, he doesn't have to sacrifice himself. And I find in the Tanakh in general, people just should do more talking, like Adam and Chava, right, Rivka and right.
Rivka and Yitzchak. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, but they could have solved a lot of problems just by talking. So
Yeah, there's not a lot of, sometimes what we feel would be solved by communication is resolved through making ultimate sacrifices of deed, right? And that's a general question. I think that is not just limited to this story, but applies to a number of different episodes in Tanakh. I suppose that, Rabbi Nachman talks about this idea about sometimes he gives the analogy that when two people are facing each other and one person is speaking, sometimes the listener will hear him and sometimes he won't hear him. It all depends on the level of turbulence that's in the air. So like if there's a helicopter overhead and I'm speaking to you from 6 feet away, you won't be able to hear me, even though you can clearly see me and I'm communicating, but you can't hear that communication. The air has to be peaceful and quiet in order for people to be able to communicate verbally with each other. And I get the impression that a lot of times there's a lot of turbulence in the air in many of these stories in Tanakh, including even Yitzchak and Rivka. And that's sometimes the reason why only action works. I don't know if that answers your question, but it works. It just sort of helps me at least understand what the Torah lesson is trying to communicate.
thank you.
Okay. All right, everybody. So have a wonderful summer. We look forward to seeing you all soon. I'm around over the summer, so if anyone needs me, you know where to find me. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you.